March 4, 2018, 500 miles off the eastern coast of Australia, somewhere in the Coral Sea, in water so deep that no human being could survive the pressure at the bottom, a remotely operated vehicle is descending through absolute darkness. The vehicle is the size of a small car. It is attached by a thin fiber optic cable to a research vessel on the surface, called Petrel, a ship built and funded by Microsoft co-founder Paul Allen for the sole purpose of finding things the ocean has swallowed. The men and women watching the camera feed in the Petrel's operations room have been searching for days. The sonar data has been promising. The coordinates have been narrowed. But the screens have shown nothing except silt, rock, and the featureless grey plain of the deep ocean floor. At this depth, nearly 2 miles down, the water temperature hovers just above freezing. The pressure is roughly 300 times what it is at the surface. Nothing lives here that you would recognize. Nothing has moved here in a very long time. Then, at a depth of roughly 3,000 meters, the vehicle's lights sweep across something that should not exist at the bottom of the Pacific Ocean. It is a fighter plane, a Grumman Wildcat, sitting almost upright on the seabed, its wings still attached, its propeller bent forward from the impact of a landing it never completed. And on the fuselage, visible after more than 7 decades underwater, is a painted cartoon. A black cat, grinning. Felix the Cat, the insignia of Fighting Squadron Three, the squadron that had once included the most famous naval aviator of the early Pacific War, a man named Butch O'Hare. The paint has no business being that clear. The metal has no business being that intact. The cat has no business grinning after 76 years on the floor of the ocean. But it is, and it is not alone. As the camera pans outward, the operators begin counting. There are more aircraft scattered around the wreck site. 3 Douglas Dauntless dive bombers, 7 Devastator torpedo planes, 11 aircraft in total, lying in the silt as if someone had set them down carefully and walked away. Beyond the aircraft, the vehicle's lights find something larger, a hull, enormous, broken into sections but recognizable. 5-inch anti-aircraft guns, still pointed at the sky, still in their firing positions, aimed at an enemy that came for them on a morning in May of 1942 and never left. This is the wreck of the United States ship Lexington, hull designation CV-2. The ship the Navy called Lady Lex. The first American fleet aircraft carrier lost in the Second World War. She went down on May 8, 1942, during a battle most people have never heard of, in a sea most people cannot find on a map. 216 of her crew went down with her. Not one of them drowned. Every single death was from bombs, torpedoes, fire, or the series of internal explosions that tore the ship apart from the inside after her own crew believed they had saved her. That is the detail you need to hold in your mind as this story unfolds. The enemy hit the Lexington. The crew fought back. The damage control teams stopped the flooding, corrected the list, and brought the ship back up to 25 knots. For a brief window of time on that May afternoon, the men aboard Lady Lex believed they had won. They believed she would survive. And then their own ship killed them. Not the Japanese. Not the torpedoes. Gasoline vapor from ruptured fuel lines, seeping invisibly through the hull, reaching an electrical generator that was still running, still throwing sparks into a space no one had thought to check, because the emergency was supposed to be over. The explosion at 12:47 in the afternoon was the moment the Lexington died. Everything after that was a funeral that took 5 hours to finish, and 8 decades later, when cameras finally reached her, she was lying on the ocean floor, looking as though she had been waiting the entire time for someone to come back. Here is the question this story turns on. It is not a question about a ship. It is a question about what happens when the ocean gives something back. What are those cameras finding down there, 2 miles beneath the Pacific, that still matters after more than 80 years? What does a grinning cartoon cat on the side of a fighter plane have to tell us about the men who served on a ship that most Americans have never heard of? And why, in January of 2026, did the United States Navy announce that it is going back for more? To answer those questions, we cannot start with the battle. We have to start with the ship herself, because the Lexington was never supposed to be what she became. She was supposed to be a battle cruiser, The story of how she became an aircraft carrier instead is, in a way, the story of how the entire Pacific War was shaped by a decision that had nothing to do with combat and everything to do with a piece of paper signed in a hotel ballroom in Washington. In 1921, the United States Navy laid down the keel of a ship designated CC-1 at the Fore River Shipyard in Quincy, Massachusetts. She was going to be a Lexington-class battle cruiser, one of a planned class of 6, the fastest and most heavily armed cruiser hulls the Navy had ever designed. Then, in 1922, the Washington Naval Treaty changed everything. The major naval powers agreed to limit warship construction to prevent an arms race. Battleships and battle cruisers were capped. Construction was halted. But the treaty included a loophole. Existing battlecruiser hulls could be converted into aircraft carriers. The Navy looked at the 2 hulls furthest along, Lexington and Saratoga, and made a decision that would alter the course of the war 20 years later. They turned the battlecruisers into carriers. Lexington was launched on October 3, 1925, and commissioned on December 14, 1927. She was enormous. Her flight deck ran 866 feet. Her hangar deck, when she was built, was described as the largest enclosed space afloat on any ship in the world. Her turbo-electric propulsion system was so powerful that in the winter of 1929, when a drought cut off hydroelectric power to the city of Tacoma, Washington, the Navy sent Lexington to the harbor and plugged her into the city's electrical grid. For a month, an aircraft carrier lit the homes and ran the streetcars of an American city. That is not a legend. That happened. By the time war came, the Lexington carried roughly 100 officers and 1,840 enlisted men. She had spent more than a decade as one of the workhorses of the Pacific Fleet, participating in annual fleet exercises in the Hawaiian Islands, the Caribbean, and off the Panama Canal. Her pilots had practiced dive bombing and torpedo runs thousands of times. Her crew had drilled damage control procedures until they could run hoses and shore up bulkheads in the dark. She was, by December of 1941, one of the most experienced ships in the Navy, and one of only 3 aircraft carriers the Pacific Fleet had available when the Japanese struck Pearl Harbor. The Lexington herself was at sea that morning, ferrying fighter aircraft to Midway Island. She was not in the harbor. She survived the day that destroyed the battleship fleet by the simple accident of being somewhere else. Her captain was Frederick Sherman, a 1910 Annapolis graduate from Port Huron, Michigan, a chain-smoking former submarine commander from the First World War who had a reputation for 2 things. First, he could dock the massive carrier without tugboats, threading nearly 900 feet of warship into tight berths with a combination of engine commands and intuition that other captains would not attempt. Second, he had a cocker spaniel named Admiral Wags, who lived aboard the ship and had his own designated muster station listed in the ship's emergency procedures, which was under the captain's bed. The crew adored the dog. They adored the ship. They adored the captain who could handle her. Sherman's Lexington was not just a warship. She was a community. Almost 2,000 men lived and worked aboard her, and they had given her a personality. The crew called her Lady Lex. They painted the name on bulkheads, stitched it into unofficial patches, and talked about the ship the way men talk about a place they belong to, not a machine they operate. This matters for what comes later. When the order came to abandon ship on the afternoon of May 8, 1942, the men who went over the side were not leaving a vessel. They were leaving home, but before the Lexington fought her last battle, she produced a moment that belongs to the permanent record of American naval aviation, and it involved a young pilot whose story is almost too strange to be real. Edward Henry O'Hare was born on March 13, 1914, in St. Louis, Missouri. His father, known around Chicago as Easy Eddie, was a lawyer, a businessman, and a close associate of Al Capone. Easy Eddie managed parts of Capone's gambling empire, lived in a mansion the size of a city block, and eventually, for reasons historians still debate, decided to cooperate with federal authorities to help bring Capone down. On November 8, 1939, Easy Eddie was shot and killed on a Chicago street. His son Butch, by then a young ensign in the United States Navy, heard the news and said almost nothing about it in public for the rest of his life. Butch O'Hare graduated from the Naval Academy in 1937, earned his wings in 1940, and was assigned to Fighting Squadron Three, which flew Grumman Wildcat fighters. When the Japanese torpedoed the carrier Saratoga in January of 1942, Fighting Squadron Three transferred to the Lexington. On February 20, 1942, the Lexington was steaming toward the Japanese base at Rabaul when enemy reconnaissance aircraft spotted her. The Japanese scrambled bombers. 2 waves of Mitsubishi Betty medium bombers came in to sink the carrier. The first wave was intercepted and broken up by a flight of Wildcats led by Lieutenant Commander Jimmy Thatch, the man who would later give his name to the Thatch Weave, one of the most important fighter tactics of the war. But the second wave approached from a different direction. Only 2 American fighters were close enough to intercept. One of them was Butch O'Hare. The other was his wingman, whose guns jammed almost immediately. That left Butch O'Hare alone in the sky between the Lexington and 8 Japanese bombers closing fast. He had limited ammunition, roughly enough for 34 seconds of sustained fire. The Mitsubishi Bettys had rear-facing 20mm cannons, which meant that attacking them from behind was suicide. O'Hare did not attack from behind. He came in from an angle, using a deflection shooting technique that his squadron commander Jimmy Thatch had drilled into his pilots during months of practice, leading the target the way a duck hunter leads a bird in flight. He attacked anyway. He dove on the formation, opened fire, and flamed 1 bomber on the first pass. He pulled up, came around, picked another, and bored in from the opposite side. The second bomber burned. He came around again, and again. Jimmy Thatch, watching from a distance, too far away to help but close enough to see, later reported that at one point he saw 3 Japanese planes falling in flames at the same time. In roughly 4 minutes, O'Hare shot down 5 enemy bombers and damaged a 6th. Thatch later estimated that O'Hare had used approximately 60 rounds of ammunition per kill, a level of marksmanship that gunnery instructors would study for years. The remaining bombers scattered. Not a single bomb hit the Lexington. One young pilot, alone, with half a minute of ammunition, had saved a carrier and nearly 2,000 men. O'Hare became the Navy's first flying ace of the Second World War and the first naval aviator to receive the Medal of Honor. President Franklin Roosevelt personally directed the ceremony. O'Hare's wife, Rita, placed the medal around his neck at the White House on April 21, 1942. He was described afterward by the Washington Press Corps as modest, a little embarrassed by the attention, and possessed of a dry humor. When asked what improvements he would like to see in American fighters, he said without hesitation that he wanted a plane that could climb faster than a Zero. He would get that wish. Grumman was already building the Hellcat. O'Hare would not survive the war. On the night of November 26, 1943, while leading the Navy's first ever nighttime fighter attack from an aircraft carrier, his Hellcat was shot down near Tarawa. His body was never recovered. He was 29 years old. In 1949, Chicago renamed its main airport in his honor. Today, O'Hare International is one of the busiest airports in the world. Millions of people pass through it every year. Almost none of them know whose name is on the building, or that the man it honors once stood alone between a carrier full of 2,000 men and a sky full of bombers, with nothing but a Wildcat and half a minute of ammunition. In mid-April of 1942, days before his Medal of Honor ceremony, Butch O'Hare left the Lexington and flew back to the United States. Around the same time, many of his squadron mates from Fighting Squadron Three sailed aboard the Lexington on what would be her final voyage. 3 weeks later, Lady Lex would be at the bottom of the Coral Sea, and some of the men O'Hare had flown with would be among the 216 who did not come home. The battle that killed the Lexington began because American codebreakers at Pearl Harbor cracked a Japanese cipher called JN-25. They learned that the Imperial Japanese Navy was planning a major operation designated Operation Mo. The objective was Port Moresby, the capital of the Australian territory of Papua New Guinea. If Port Moresby fell, Japan would control the air and sea approaches to Australia itself. The Allies could not allow it. By the spring of 1942, the strategic situation in the Pacific was desperate. In the 5 months since Pearl Harbor, the Japanese had seemed unstoppable. They had taken the Philippines, they had taken Wake Island, Guam, Hong Kong, Thailand, Malaya, Singapore, and the Netherlands East Indies. The British had lost 2 capital ships off Malaya in a single afternoon. The American Asiatic fleet had been effectively destroyed at the Battle of the Java Sea. The only bright spot in the entire half-year had been the Doolittle raid on Tokyo in April, which had done almost no physical damage but had rattled the Japanese high command. Everything else had been defeat after defeat after defeat. Into this darkness, Admiral Chester Nimitz, commander of the Pacific Fleet, ordered Task Force 17 to the Coral Sea to stop the Port Moresby invasion. The force centered on 2 carriers: Lexington, under Captain Sherman, with Rear Admiral Aubrey Fitch commanding carrier air operations from her flag bridge, and Yorktown, under Captain Elliot Buckmaster, with Rear Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher in overall tactical command. Between them, they carried roughly 150 aircraft and close to 5,000 men. They were sailing into a battle unlike anything the world had ever seen. The Battle of the Coral Sea would be the first naval engagement in history in which the opposing ships never saw each other. Every blow would be struck by aircraft. Every decision would be made by men who could not see the enemy fleet with their own eyes. No warship in either fleet would fire a gun at another warship. The aircraft would do all the killing. On May 7, 1942, aircraft from Lexington and Yorktown found the Japanese light carrier Shoho and sank her in minutes. It was a slaughter. Bombs and torpedoes hit her in rapid succession. Her flight deck burned. Her power failed. She flooded and went down. Lieutenant Commander Robert Dixon, circling above in his Dauntless, sent back a radio transmission that entered the permanent vocabulary of the United States Navy. He said simply, "Scratch one flat top." It was the first time in the war that American carrier aircraft had sunk a Japanese carrier. For a few hours, the men on Lexington felt something they had not felt since December 7, 1941. They felt like they were winning. The next morning, May 8th, changed everything. The Japanese knew where the American carriers were, and the Americans knew where the Japanese were. Both sides launched strikes at almost the same time. The American aircraft went after the Japanese carriers Shokaku and Zuikaku. The Japanese aircraft came for Lexington and Yorktown. It was, for a few terrible hours, a race to see who could cripple the other first. The American strike damaged Shokaku badly, setting fires and wrecking her flight deck. Zuikaku escaped into a rain squall and was never found, but the Japanese strike was devastating. At approximately 11:13, the Lexington's radar picked up incoming aircraft at 70 miles. The ship went to general quarters. Every man aboard went to his battle station. The anti-aircraft guns were manned and loaded. The Wildcats of Fighting Squadron 2 were in the air, climbing to intercept. The Japanese came in 2 waves. Torpedo planes skimmed the water at masthead height from port. Dive bombers plunged from above. The anti-aircraft fire was intense. Tracers filled the sky. Several Japanese planes were hit and went into the sea, but enough of them got through. At 11:20, 2 Japanese Type 91 aerial torpedoes slammed into Lexington's port side, one forward near the aviation gasoline storage, the other slightly aft. The impacts were massive. The ship lurched. The hull plating buckled inward. Fuel tanks ruptured. Boiler rooms flooded. The ship shuddered and began listing to port. Bombs struck the deck in rapid succession, one of them detonating near the port 5-inch gun gallery. The blast killed and wounded the gun crews at their stations. Men who had been standing at the ready a moment before were suddenly gone. Another bomb hit further aft, sending shrapnel through compartments and starting fires in the officer country. In less than 10 minutes, the ship that had been steaming along at 25 knots under a clear Coral Sea sky had become a listing, burning, flooding wreck. And then, in a display of seamanship and damage control that even the official Navy historians would later describe with something close to awe, the crew of the Lexington fought back. This was what they had trained for. This was the reason the Navy drilled damage control until men could do it in their sleep. Damage control parties attacked the fires with hoses and chemical foam. Engineers pumped fuel from the port tanks to the starboard side to correct the 7-degree list that was making the flight deck unusable. They patched what they could reach. They shored up flooded compartments with timbers and braces. Welders went to work on ruptured pipes while seawater still poured through cracks around them. Within an hour, the ship was back on an even keel and making 25 knots. By early afternoon, the Lexington was recovering her aircraft. Planes that had been circling overhead, low on fuel, and shot up from their own strike missions, came back aboard. Her flight deck was operational. Her engines were running. Her steering was intact. Officers on the bridge were already discussing the route back to Pearl Harbor for repairs. Some of the crew later said that the mood on the ship in that brief window was almost euphoric. They had taken 2 torpedoes and multiple bombs. They had put out the fires. They had fixed the list. They were still moving, still fighting, still alive. For 1 hour, the men aboard the Lexington believed they had saved their ship. Some of them said later that it was the proudest hour of their lives. Among the men fighting hardest to keep the ship alive was Commander Howard Healy, the damage control officer. Healy was 43 years old, born in Chelsea, Massachusetts, an Annapolis graduate of the class of 1922 who had gone on to study engineering at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology and the University of Michigan. He had married a librarian named Josephine Kenkel in 1933. Healy's job that morning was to coordinate every firefighting and repair effort aboard the ship from the Central Damage Control Station, the nerve center of the entire operation, receiving reports from every section, directing hoses and teams and pumps to wherever the crisis was worst. The crisis appeared to be under control. The fires were dying. The flooding was contained. The ship was moving. Healy had done his job. His training had worked. The system had worked. Then, at 12:47 in the afternoon, 1 hour and 27 minutes after the torpedoes hit, the Lexington destroyed herself. What happened was this. The torpedoes that hit the port side had not only ruptured fuel storage tanks and flooded boiler rooms, they had cracked the aviation gasoline trunk lines, the pipes that carried high-octane fuel from the ship's deep storage tanks up to the hangar deck for refueling aircraft. These lines ran through the interior of the ship, through compartments and passageways that were not designed to contain gasoline. When the torpedo warheads detonated against the hull, the shock wave, what naval engineers call the mining effect, traveled inward through the ship's structure and opened hairline fractures in those fuel lines and in the bulkheads surrounding them. Gasoline, mixed with seawater, seeped through those small cracks and entered the motor generator room, a compartment deep inside the ship that housed electrical machinery. In that room, generators were still running, still producing the electrical current the ship needed to operate, still inevitably producing sparks. Nobody knew the gasoline vapor was there. It had accumulated slowly, invisibly, pooling at the lowest point in the compartment, because gasoline vapor is heavier than air and sinks. Nobody smelled it in time. The ventilation systems that might have cleared it were damaged or shut down. Nobody could have known to check. The damage control teams, Howard Healy's teams, were fighting the fires they could see, the floods they could measure, the list they could calculate. They were dealing with the emergency that was visible. The gas was in a space they had no reason to inspect, because by every measure they had, the emergency was over. They had won. The ship was saved. The spark hit the vapor. The explosion was catastrophic. The official war damage report would later attribute the disaster to, and these are the Navy's own words, an accumulation of gasoline vapor in the motor generator room in the presence of operating electrical machinery which was capable of producing electric sparks. About 25 men were killed or seriously wounded in the blast. The main damage control station, the central nervous system of the entire ship's fight for survival, was knocked out. Howard Healy died at his post. The blast blew open ventilation ducts, and fire raced through those ducts into the chief petty officer's quarters, into mess halls, into passageways and berthing spaces that had been untouched minutes before. A second major explosion followed at 14:42, a third at 1525. Each one knocked out more systems, killed more men, spread more fire. The chain of internal explosions that followed turned a ship the crew had just saved into a ship that could not be saved. The cruelest part of the Lexington's death is that the Japanese did not kill her. Her own fuel system did. She survived the enemy and lost to physics. The fires spread beyond the reach of any hose. The water mains failed. Without water pressure, the firefighting teams were left with nothing to fight with. The hangar deck became an inferno. Aircraft that had not been pushed overboard caught fire and added their fuel to the blaze. Warheads in the ready ammunition storage reached 140 degrees Fahrenheit. The ship's executive officer, Commander Seligman, warned that the magazines could detonate at any moment. Captain Sherman weighed the risk. He could keep men aboard fighting a fire that was beyond control, or he could get them off the ship while the ship was still stable enough to allow an orderly evacuation. He chose his crew. At 1707, nearly 6 hours after the first torpedo hit, Sherman gave the order to abandon ship. He said it plainly, without ceremony. The word passed from compartment to compartment, from station to station. The men of the Lexington were going over the side. What happened next is one of the most remarkable abandonments in the history of the United States Navy, and possibly in the history of any navy. The Coral Sea that afternoon was warm and calm, the swells were gentle, visibility was clear. Destroyers and cruisers from the task force pulled alongside the burning carrier and took men aboard directly over rails and lines. The destroyer Morris came alongside and passed fire hoses over, though by that point the fires were beyond any help. Other sailors went down ropes and cargo nets into the sea and were picked up by whaleboats and motor launches. The evacuation was orderly, almost eerily so. There are accounts from survivors describing men lining up on the listing flight deck as if they were waiting for a bus, as if this were another drill and someone would blow a whistle and tell them it was over. One group of sailors, according to multiple post-war interviews, discovered that the ship's ice cream stores were still accessible and helped themselves. They stood on the flight deck of a burning aircraft carrier eating ice cream while they waited for their turn to go over the side. It was not bravado. It was not defiance. It was something quieter than either of those. It was men who had accepted what was happening and who had decided that if this was the last hour they were going to spend aboard their ship, they were not going to spend it panicking. Captain Sherman waited until he was certain every living man was off the ship. He walked the decks. He checked the compartments that were still accessible. He shouted into smoke-filled passageways. He satisfied himself that no one had been left behind. Then, at approximately 1830, an hour and a half after the abandoned ship order, Sherman left the Lexington. He was the last man off. He carried Admiral Waggs under his arm. The Cocker Spaniel survived the war. So did the captain, who would go on to earn 3 Navy Crosses and rise to flag rank. 2,770 officers and men were rescued from the water and from alongside that afternoon. Not a single man drowned during the evacuation. Every one of the 216 who died had already been killed by the time the order came to abandon ship. They died at their guns. They died in the fires. They died in the explosions. They died doing their jobs. The warm sea that swallowed the Lexington that evening did not kill a single additional man. That evening, the destroyer Phelps was ordered to finish it. She fired 5 torpedoes into the burning hull. At approximately 2000 hours, 8 in the evening, the Lexington slipped beneath the surface on an even keel. As she went under, a final massive explosion shook ships 20 miles away. It was the end of Lady Lex. She settled to the bottom of the Coral Sea, nearly 2 miles down, and she would not be seen again for 76 years. Every like on this video is a small act, but it keeps the names of the 216 men who died aboard the Lexington visible for a little longer. They earned that. The least we can do is not let the algorithm forget them. Among the 216, there are men whose stories deserve to be told by name, because the number 216 is an abstraction, and the men were not. Howard Healy, the damage control officer who died at his station, fighting fires that were already beyond control, was posthumously awarded the Bronze Star. The Navy named a destroyer after him, the USS Healy, hull number DD-672. His wife Josephine received the news at their home in Long Beach, California. He was 43 years old. Then there was a young Marine named Jesse Rutherford Jr. His story is the kind of story that makes you sit with it for a while before you are ready to move on. Rutherford was a teenager from Kansas. Some records place his birth in Salmon, Idaho, but his family lived in Chanute, Kansas, and that is where his mother Mary was when everything happened. In 1941, young Jesse wanted to enlist in the Marine Corps. He needed his mother's signature because he was underage. She refused. She did not want her boy going to war. Jesse enlisted anyway under a false name. He signed up as Raymond Miller. His training instructors, his bunkmates, the Marines who served beside him on the Lexington, every single one of them knew him as Miller. On May 8, 1942, Private Miller was manning a 5-inch anti-aircraft gun when a bomb fragment tore into him. He was mortally wounded. He did not leave his station. He stayed on his feet, setting fuses for the 5-inch shells, feeding the gun that was keeping Japanese planes away from the ship, until his body could no longer hold him upright, and he collapsed on the deck. Jesse Rutherford Jr., the boy who had run away from home under a fake name because his mother would not let him go to war, was awarded the Navy Cross. His mother Mary later stood on a platform at a shipyard and christened the destroyer escort that the Navy named in her son's honor. The ship was called the USS Jesse Rutherford, hull number DE-347, not the USS Raymond Miller. The Navy gave the ship the name the boy had left behind, the name his mother had tried to keep safe. There was Lieutenant Junior Grade Edward Price, from Richmond, Virginia, a Naval Academy graduate who had ranked near the top of his class. Price commanded a gun battery from the after control station. When a bomb fragment struck him, he was in the middle of directing fire. The men around him later reported that the last words they heard him say were 2 words: keep firing. He was about 25 years old, and there was the crew of gun number 6. A direct bomb hit detonated in the ready ammunition locker beside their gun station. The blast killed the entire gun crew, roughly 14 men. Their remains were never recovered from the ship. They are still down there, 2 miles beneath the Coral Sea, at the station where they died. They have been there for more than 80 years. They will be there when every person listening to this is gone. If your family has a connection to the Lexington, if your grandfather or great-grandfather served on her, or if anyone in your family served on any ship in the Pacific during the Second World War, I would be grateful if you would share their story in the comments. Those details, the personal ones, the ones no archive preserves, matter more than any official record. They are the actual history, and they deserve to be written down by the people who still carry them. Now, here is the part of the story that most people miss. The part that turns a tragedy into something larger. The Lexington's death was not just a loss, it was an investment, and the return on that investment came exactly 1 month later at a place called Midway. The Battle of the Coral Sea was, in strictly material terms, a Japanese tactical victory. Japan lost the light carrier Shoho, a small ship carrying a small air group. The United States lost a fleet carrier, one of the largest and most powerful warships in the Pacific, along with the destroyer Sims and the fleet oiler Neosho. By tonnage, by aircraft, by any balance sheet a naval accountant would keep, the Japanese came out ahead. That is why most history books treat Coral Sea as a footnote, a minor engagement before the real turning point at Midway. Ask 10 people what the most important naval battle of the Pacific War was, and 9 of them will say Midway. Almost nobody says Coral Sea. But Midway cannot be understood without Coral Sea, and the Lexington is the reason why. Here is what happened. The American strike aircraft from both Lexington and Yorktown hit the Japanese carrier Shokaku so badly that her flight deck was wrecked, and she needed months of yard time in Japan before she could fight again. Zuikaku, the second Japanese fleet carrier at Coral Sea, escaped with her hull undamaged because she had hidden under a rain squall during the American attack. But Zuikaku's air groups had been gutted. She had lost pilots and aircraft in numbers that could not be replaced in 4 weeks because trained carrier pilots take years to produce, and the Japanese training pipeline was already stretched to its limit. When Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto launched his grand offensive at Midway in June of 1942, the operation that was supposed to draw out and destroy the American Pacific Fleet once and for all, he expected to bring overwhelming carrier air power. He planned on 6 fleet carriers. He got 4. Shokaku was in dry dock. Zuikaku was short of pilots and planes and stayed home. The Lexington and her 216 dead had taken them off the board. At Midway, the Americans sank all 4 Japanese carriers in a single day, June 4, 1942. Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, the core of the Japanese striking force that had attacked Pearl Harbor, were all at the bottom of the Pacific by nightfall. The war turned on that day. Historians and wargamers have debated for 80 years what would have happened if Japan had brought 6 carriers to Midway instead of 4. The consensus is sobering. 2 additional flight decks would have meant roughly 150 more aircraft in the air. The Japanese strike coordination, which was thrown into chaos at the critical moment by the American dive bombers, would have had more resilience. The outcome might have been the same, or it might not. No one can be certain. What is certain is that Shokaku and Zuikaku were not there, and they were not there because of what the Lexington and her crew did in the Coral Sea. If the Lexington had not fought, if those 216 men had not died on a ship that killed itself from the inside out, the Battle of Midway becomes a different equation. And if Midway goes differently, the Pacific War becomes a different war entirely. The Navy understood this. Shortly after the Lexington's loss was made public in June of 1942, workers at the Fore River shipyard in Quincy, Massachusetts, the same yard that had built the original Lexington 20 years earlier, sent a telegram to Navy Secretary Frank Knox. They asked that a new Essex-class carrier under construction at their yard be renamed Lexington. Knox agreed. The new Lexington CV-16 was commissioned in 1943. She fought through the rest of the Pacific War, served in multiple conflicts afterward, and was finally decommissioned in 1991. Today she sits in Corpus Christi, Texas, as a museum ship. You can walk her decks. You can stand where her pilots launched. She is the 7th ship in United States Navy history to carry the name. But the first Lexington, the original Lady Lex, was 2 miles down in the Coral Sea, and for more than 7 decades nobody knew exactly where. The search for the Lexington was made possible by a man who had spent much of his life and his fortune looking for things the ocean had swallowed. Paul Allen, the co-founder of Microsoft, was not a military historian by training. He was an engineer, a technologist, and a collector with a deep personal interest in the Second World War. He had funded the construction of a custom research vessel called Petrel, equipped with state-of-the-art sonar, autonomous underwater vehicles, and remotely operated vehicles capable of reaching depths of 6,000 meters, nearly 4 miles down. He had staffed the ship with a crew of deep-sea exploration specialists under the direction of Robert Kraft, his director of subsea operations. Allen's mission was simple in concept and staggering in execution. He wanted to find lost warships. And he did. In 2015, Allen's team located the Japanese super battleship Musashi in the Sibuyan Sea, one of the largest warships ever built, sunk during the Battle of Leyte Gulf. In 2017, they found the heavy cruiser Indianapolis, the ship that delivered the core components of the atomic bomb, dropped on Hiroshima and was then torpedoed by a Japanese submarine on the return trip, leaving nearly 900 men in the water for 4 days in one of the worst maritime disasters in American naval history. In March of 2018, within days of finding the Lexington, the team also located the light cruiser Juno, the ship on which the 5 Sullivan brothers from Waterloo, Iowa, had served and died together, an event so devastating that the Navy later adopted a policy of separating siblings across different ships. And on March 4, 2018, the Petrel's remotely operated vehicle descended into the Coral Sea and found the Lexington. The wreck was located roughly 500 miles off the coast of Queensland, Australia, at a depth of approximately 3,000 meters. The vehicle confirmed the ship's identity by reading the nameplate on the stern still legible after 3/4 of a century underwater. Then the cameras began a systematic survey of what the ocean had preserved, and the results were extraordinary. The ship had broken into several sections during her descent or upon impact with the ocean floor. The main hull rested upright. The bow and stern had separated. The bridge structure had come free and lay by itself on the seabed, recognizable as a bridge, with its windows and fittings still partially intact. Debris was scattered around the wreck site in a wide field, the result of explosions during the sinking and the long fall through 2 miles of water. But the condition of the wreckage stunned the exploration team and stunned the historians who reviewed the footage afterward. Cold water, extreme pressure, and the near-total absence of oxygen at that depth had turned the Lexington into something closer to a time capsule than a ruin. Corrosion had been slowed to a fraction of what it would have been in shallower water. Paint that should have been gone in a decade was still visible. Metal that should have been eaten through was still holding its shape. The aircraft were the most striking discovery, and the images of them would become the defining images of the entire expedition. 11 planes lay scattered around the wreck, some near the hull, some hundreds of yards away, thrown clear during the final explosions, or carried off by currents during the 2-mile fall to the ocean floor. The cameras counted 3 Douglas Dauntless dive bombers, the same type that would devastate the Japanese carrier fleet at Midway a month after the Lexington sank. 7 Devastator torpedo planes, the slow, vulnerable aircraft that torpedo squadrons flew at wave-top height into the teeth of anti-aircraft fire. And 1 Grumman Wildcat fighter. The Wildcat stopped people cold. It was sitting nearly upright on the seabed, its landing gear gone, its propeller bent, but its fuselage remarkably intact. On the side of the aircraft, visible in the camera lights as clearly as if it had been painted the week before, was a cartoon. A black cat, grinning. Felix the Cat. The insignia of Fighting Squadron Three, the squadron Butch O'Hare had flown with when he single-handedly defended the Lexington against those Japanese bombers 3 months before the ship sank. And beneath the cartoon cat, 4 small Japanese flags, each one representing an aerial victory scored by the pilot who had flown that plane. This was not Butch O'Hare's aircraft. O'Hare had been sent home before the final voyage, and his personal Wildcat had carried 5 flags, not 4. But it was his squadron's plane. It bore his squadron's symbol. The pilot who had flown it, whose name may be in a logbook somewhere but has not been publicly identified from the wreck footage, had killed 4 Japanese aircraft in other engagements. He had earned those flags. And his plane, with its grinning cat and its 4 tiny victories, had been sitting in the dark at the bottom of the Coral Sea since 1942, unseen, unvisited, waiting. The 5-inch anti-aircraft guns were still in their firing positions, still trained outward, still aimed at a sky they had not seen since 1942. The barrels had not moved, the mounts had not corroded away. They looked, in the camera footage, as if the gun crews had simply stepped away and never come back. In a sense, that is exactly what happened. Some of those gun crews walked away to the rails and went over the side and survived. Others did not walk away at all. Paul Allen said publicly after the discovery that the Lexington crew's sacrifice was not forgotten and that the men who served on her deserved to be honored. Admiral Harry Harris, Jr., then the commander of United States Pacific Command, released a statement that carried a personal weight most official statements do not. Harris was the son of a Lexington survivor. His father had been one of the 2,770 men who went over the side on the afternoon of May 8, 1942, and lived. Harris congratulated the expedition team and said he offered his thoughts in honor of the valor and sacrifice of Lady Lex's sailors. Allen himself died in October of 2018, 7 months after the discovery. The Petrel continued its work under the foundation he had established. The wreck of the Lexington is protected under the Sunken Military Craft Act of 2004, which prohibits unauthorized disturbance or salvage of any sunken United States military vessel anywhere in the world. The ship is a war grave. The exploration team documented the site, shared the data with the Navy, and did not disturb the wreckage or attempt to recover artifacts. The 216 men who died aboard her, including the gun crew of gun number 6 whose remains were never recovered, are still at their stations. But the Lexington's story did not end with the discovery. The aircraft found on the seabed sparked a question that had been nagging historians and preservationists for decades. Of all the planes the Lexington carried, the ones lying on the ocean floor included 7 Devastators. The Douglas TBD-1 Devastator was the Navy's first all-metal carrier-based torpedo bomber. It was the aircraft that flew the suicidal torpedo runs at Midway, the runs in which entire squadrons were wiped out almost to the last man. Of the 129 Devastators built for service, not a single one survives on land. Every known example rests on the ocean floor. There is no Devastator in any museum. There is no Devastator in any private collection. The type has been completely lost. On January 30th, 2026, the Naval History and Heritage Command, together with the Air and Sea Heritage Foundation and Texas A&M University's Center for Maritime Archaeology and Conservation, announced the launch of a project they called the Devastator Project. Their objective was to recover a TBD-1 Devastator, Bureau number 1515, from the floor of Jalowit Lagoon in the Marshall Islands. This aircraft was not from the Lexington. It had launched from the carrier Yorktown on February 1, 1942, during the Navy's first offensive operation of the Pacific War, a raid on Japanese positions in the Marshall and Gilbert Islands. The crew, pilot Ensign Herbert Hine Jr., navigator Joseph Strahl, and radioman Marshall Wyndham, lost their bearings in bad weather and were forced to ditch in the lagoon. All 3 survived. All 3 were captured by the Japanese. All 3 spent the rest of the war as prisoners and were liberated in 1945. Their aircraft sank to the bottom of the lagoon, 120 feet down, and was discovered in 1997 by a diver named Matt Harris during a survey for the National Park Service. The Air and Sea Heritage Foundation conducted 7 expeditions to the site between 2003 and 2023. In 2026, the recovery was formally approved. The plan is to bring Bureau number 1515 to the surface, conserve it in its current condition, and display it in the future National Museum of the United States Navy in Washington. It will be the only Devastator in existence. The same type of aircraft that sits on the ocean floor around the Lexington, the same type that flew the doomed torpedo runs at Midway, will finally be seen on land for the first time in more than 80 years. The Devastator Project is not a recovery from the Lexington's wreck. It is a recovery of the same kind of aircraft, from the same period, flown by men who served in the same war and suffered the same kind of fate. The connection is not physical. It is something harder to name. It is the recognition that the machines and the men who flew them belong to the same story, and that losing every single example of an aircraft type to the ocean floor is a form of forgetting that a museum can fight. Here is where the story arrives at the thing it has been building toward. It is not the ship. It is not the aircraft. It is not even the battle. It is what the discovery means, and what the act of going back means, and why that act keeps happening. When the remotely operated vehicle's cameras lit up the Lexington's wreck site in 2018, what they found was not a ruin. Ruins decay. Ruins crumble. Ruins become unrecognizable over time, and the act of looking at them reinforces the distance between then and now. The Lexington had not done any of those things. She had been preserved by the very forces that buried her: the cold, the pressure, the absence of light and oxygen. The guns were still aimed. The cat was still grinning. The planes were still scattered around her, as if the last afternoon of her life had only just ended. And that preservation is the reason the discovery hit people with a force that photographs of monuments and plaques never quite achieve. It is easy to put 80 years of distance between yourself and a historical event when the evidence has decayed into abstraction. It is not easy when the evidence looks like it happened last week. The Lexington on the ocean floor is not a memorial. A memorial is something we choose to build. The Lexington is something that simply persisted, without anyone's knowledge, without anyone's help, at the bottom of the Pacific, for longer than most of the people who will ever see the footage have been alive. She did not wait for us to decide she was important. She was just there, holding her shape, holding her dead, holding the guns at the angle they were pointed when the last man left. The 216 men who died aboard her include every kind of man the United States Navy put into uniform in 1942. Career officers like Howard Healy, who had studied engineering at two of the finest universities in the country and died trying to save a ship with knowledge that was brilliant but not quite enough. Teenagers like Jesse Rutherford, who wanted to fight so badly he invented a new identity to do it and then proved that the name did not matter because the courage was his, not Raymond Miller's. Scholars like Edward Price, who graduated near the top of his academy class and whose last two words were an order that every gun crew in every navy has understood since the first cannon was loaded on the first ship. And 14 men at gun number 6 whose names are on a roster in a government archive, but whose faces are gone, whose voices are gone, whose letters home are gone, and whose remains are still at the station where they died, 2 miles down, in the dark, where the temperature never changes and the current barely moves, and nothing will disturb them for as long as the ocean exists. These men did not die in a battle that saved the world in a single dramatic afternoon the way the movies tell it. They died in an engagement that barely registers in the popular memory of the war, thousands of miles from anywhere, aboard a carrier whose own fuel system betrayed the men who had just fought to save her. Their contribution to the outcome of the war was invisible at the time. It became visible only when historians traced the chain backward from Midway and realized that the 2 missing Japanese carriers were missing because of what happened in the Coral Sea, and that what happened in the Coral Sea happened because 2,000 men on a ship called Lady Lex fought until she burned beyond saving and then climbed calmly into the water and let the destroyers come for them, and that 216 of those men never got that far. The cameras that went down to the Lexington found evidence, not artifacts, not relics, evidence. Evidence that these men existed, that they served, and that they stood at their stations when the torpedoes hit, and the fires spread, and the vapor gathered in the spaces no one was watching. Evidence that 80 years of ocean and silence and the slow settling of silt on steel did not erase what happened on the afternoon of May 8, 1942. And the Devastator Project in 2026 is not an ending to this story. It is a refusal to let the story end. Of 129 Devastators built, every single one ended up on the ocean floor. Not one was saved. Not one was set aside in a hangar somewhere for future generations to stand beside and touch and understand. The type was used up, and lost. The men who flew them were used up, and many of them were lost as well. The act of going back to Jalowit Lagoon, of sending divers down 120 feet to an aircraft that has been sitting there since February 1st, 1942, of bringing it to the surface and placing it in a museum in Washington where a child can stand beside it and realize how small it is, how fragile, how thin the metal, how exposed the cockpit. That act is not archaeology. It is an argument. It is an argument that the ocean does not get to decide what we remember. Butch O'Hare's squadron insignia is sitting on the side of a Wildcat at the bottom of the Coral Sea. Howard Healy is in the engineering textbooks he studied and in the name of a destroyer that sailed for years after he died. Jesse Rutherford is in 2 names, the real one and the invented one, both of them belonging to the same boy who refused to wait for permission to do what he believed was right. Edward Price is in 2 words, and those 2 words are the only order that has ever needed no explanation. And gun number 6 is in the silence. 14 men, no last words, no final letters, just a position on the ship's diagram and a coordinate on the ocean floor. If this story gave you something worth sitting with, that like button is how the names in it reach the people who would want to hear them. Not the algorithm, the people. Subscribe if you want the next chapter. There are more of these stories than any channel could ever tell. Most of them are about ships that went down carrying men who never made the front pages, in battles that never made the history books. Men who are still down there, in the cold, in the dark, in the silence of deep water, waiting for someone to send a light down to where they are. The Lexington waited 76 years. Her crew never stopped holding their stations. The least we can do is keep sending the cameras down, because the ocean does not remember, but we can, and as long as we do, the men of Lady Lex are not gone. They are just deep, and the light, at last, is on its way.